what is fascism? Can you give us like a brief definition to frame the conversation with?
Well, people love definitions. What I will start by saying is that definitions are not explanations. The problem we have with fascism is that it morphs, it moves, it's a work in progress. But I would say it's a far right, ultra right wing, violent movement that wants to end democracy and indeed end what we call modernity. That is everything that happened since the French Revolution of 1789. It is intrinsically racist, although the form that the racism takes differs from country to country. In the modern world, it is equally violently anti-feminist. It always leads to genocide. It always radicalizes in power if it gets power. A lot of the definitions you'll come across at school or college are what made Hitler's state fascist. What I'm interested in, there's no fascist states in the world today. What I'm interested in is how do we define or understand a far right movement? And how do we differentiate it from the much bigger and, formally speaking, democratic parties like Vox in Spain, 3 million voters, Rassemblement National in France, which will come neck and neck next year with Macron. These are not fascist parties. The problem we've had is that political scientists spent, a good 20 or 30 years working out definitions that could say, there's a fascist, there's a right-wing populist, but the boundaries and the category pigeonholes are bleeding into each other because of what's happening, as I argue in the book, in people's heads. People's heads don't obey these rigid definitions. And we see it all around us. We see, even today as we're speaking, a massive far-right movement of people mobilizing in the cities of Brazil, called by the president. He's not a fascist. Most of them are not fascist. They're right-wing individuals who are racist and hate women and hate abortion and the rest of it. But the net result is a fascist movement. Don't be so keen to kind of stack up definitions. What we better do is understand the phenomenon in its roundedness and in its the way it changes and the way it develops.
Now, one of the things that I was trying to get a handle on when I was reading the book was as you kind of mentioned there's like a bleed from the far right into the rest of the right wing. And something that quite a lot of commentators have actually pointed out in the past is that the right tended to be quite good, at least traditionally, at kind of annexing that part that was quote unquote not okay. That they were very good at sort of annexing the racists from the broader right. Do you think that's kind of stopped? Do you think that's becoming harder for the right to do?
So that was the theory. When right-wing populism emerged, remember, for some of your listeners who'll be young, will not remember that politics, until about 1989, was just, in most countries, 2 or 3 parties. You had a socialist party, you had a conservative party, often you had a liberal party. That was it. Now we've got, since the 90s, the rise of what we call right-wing populism. So these are people like Nigel Farage and UKIP, people like Marine Le Pen and her party, the Rassemblement National, the National Rally in France, who basically don't like immigrants. They mobilize the sentiment of people who don't like immigrants. They are often nostalgic for the kind of country that used to exist. So, kind of white only. I mean, we're sitting 2 stories above a street called Peckham Rye Lane. Okay, Rye Lane, Peckham. When I first came to London, this was a white area. If you look outside this window, I walked down the street. I was one of the few white people walking down the street. Now, that's a big change if you've lived through it. Yeah. If you don't like it, it's a big change. And what right-wing populism did, it mobilized the centre. I love it, by the way. London today is the most vibrant I've ever lived in it. But right-wing populism said things are changing too fast. Our culture, white, imperialist culture, Britain, claimed the right to rule half the world, more than half the world. They don't like the fact that that's gone. okay, another theory was that by creating those parties, distasteful though they are, it hoovers up people who would otherwise become fascist. So in my hometown, it's called Lee in Lancashire, near Manchester, it was the classic Labour, Tory, Liberal. And then out of nowhere, about 5% of people started voting for the BNP, which I would say is a fascist party. Then 20% voted for UKIP. And then that 20% that voted for UKIP switched to the Tories, and the town has now voted Tory in its majority for the first time in history. So we see an evolution. The problem is, worldwide, we're no longer seeing those right-wing populist parties which accept democracy and work within it, even if they don't like it, whose racism is verbal rather than violent. They're no longer playing that role of hoovering up or dampening down, or what I call in the book, a firewall against fascism. In fact, the firewall is on fire. It is the right-wing populist formations and people themselves that are themselves in crisis and being dragged to the right. And nowhere clearer do we see this than in Trump's America and post-Trump America. We see that, look, if we call the right of the Republican Party a right-wing populist group, so the various foundations, think tanks, the various state-level governments who've used right-wing populism, open racism, for example, anti-woman politics, that party is now the willing host for fascists. That party is the apologist for a fascist uprising that took place on the 6th of January in Capitol Hill. So the new situation we're facing is that right-wing populism is no longer a firewall, it's on fire, and that no matter how rigorously you define sort of organization, so you could say, okay, let's look at, there's this weird group in Britain, Patriotic Alternative. It's a straightforward neo-Nazi group. It's tiny. You could easily define that as fascist. And you could easily define, if you wanted to, UKIP, even in its now much more further right iteration that it's gone through since Brexit. You could say it's kind of right-wing populism in transition towards fascism. The problem is, so many of the followers of that politics are not really in anything where they organise art, secret Facebook groups, closed Facebook groups, Telegram channels, and the rest of it. Tommy Robinson, the most identifiable far-right figure in Britain, had 1 million followers on Facebook before Facebook shut it, more than 1 million. Facebook shut him down. Only Jeremy Corbyn had anything like that. At the time Facebook shut down Tommy Robinson, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, had about half the number of Facebook followers. Cadbury's Cream Egg, one of the most famous brands in Britain, only has 2 million. So I'd say, that million is about the size of the audience for British fascism. And the problem is their ideas are getting crazier, more theoretical. So people on the streets who used to go, I don't like migrants, their food smells funny, I don't like the way they dress, and they wouldn't like Peckham Rye Lane. They now say, I don't like Marxism. And they will quote various esoteric Marxist figures, like a theorist called Adorno, and another guy called Horkheimer. And these were just cultural theorists, but like the far right activists are now obsessed with a theoretical fascism that is very attractive if you're a kind of little boy lost in the world and you hate the world as it is and you don't like what's happening to you in the world. Suddenly you don't have to kind of rely on your prejudices. You've also got a theory. And in the book, what I tried to do was to explain to people what that theory is, how it hangs together, and why it's so attractive to people who don't like the modern, multi-ethnic, feminist, globalized world we live in.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. Don't forget our sponsor, ExpressVPN, and my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, can both be found in the links in the description below. And also, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It's the best way to help us grow. Until next time, thanks for listening.
screw the hedge funds.
You can make as many rules as you want, but if there's no teeth behind them, what's the point?
Well, like Citadel is potentially just gone in a few months. It feels like financial institutions, that they are all laughing at us by buying GME. Screw the hedge funds. Like, I will lose my entire investment if it brings them down.
Why on earth, last May, could you buy the entire company for $200 million?
What's been happening on Reddit and in social media and in the marketplace has never been seen before.
I argue that nothing is off the table. There is nothing off the table when dealing with the volumes of money in something as big as the United States stock market.
The hedge funds have clearly underestimated a group of people raised on Friday night World of Warcraft raids.
Dark pools, they're another mechanism to manipulate and cheat. Mainstream journalists don't say these things for a number of reasons. One is their sources are the people that I'm talking about, and so they can't call somebody a crook.
Superstonk and the other communities that have emerged are a hive mind, the likes of which we have never seen before. It's madness and brilliance, insanity and genius all rolled into one. It's very possible that Citadel will be gone in a few months. And not just Citadel, but the entire financial system has the potential to come crashing down. These crooks continue to gamble recklessly with the world economy, and this could be the moment that they finally get their justice.